Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.
It's just one of those records that, as I mentioned on that email I sent out that you got, is like, no matter how many times I listen to it personally, there's always something new that I can get out of it. And it's like anything, like no matter where I am, like whatever I'm searching for in that moment in my musical journey, if I listen for it in that record, it's like I can find some type of message or some type of bit of information that is helpful.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. This week's episode is a classic albums episode where I pick somebody to come on, choose an album, and we talk about that. And my guest is Alex Graf. Those of you kind of active on social channels will have seen Alex, I'm sure. He's a fantastic flat picker, great teacher. He's all over Instagram, posting really useful content on how to flat pick, how to learn guitar. He's got a great album called Sagebrush Continuum, which came out a couple of years ago, and he's working on a new one at the moment. And I bumped into him first time I went out to IBMA in 2023, and we hung out, chatted quite a lot, really got on very well, and he's a really lovely guy, and just really full of insight and really interesting to talk to about this stuff. And I got an email from him the week before this episode just talking about the album that had changed his life, and it was Tony Rice's Manzanita. And I thought, great, let's have a conversation about that. I've been looking for an excuse to get Alex on the podcast, and this was it. What I love about these is they're very personal episodes. It's not kind of the nuts and bolts of how the record was made or facts, or it's very much about how this record resonated with Alex through his journey into flat picking, coming from more of a jazz background, why the record spoke to him, what he's learned through it, the things that it's given him. Fascinating, just a really interesting conversation about a record that I know is one of people's favourites. In fact, I did a big kind of poll across multiple social channels, various different Facebook groups and things about people's favourite Tony Rice albums, and Manzanita came out top. I'm going to publish another episode about that with a full kind of run through of what people voted for, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But for now, this is my chat with Alex about Manzanita. As always with these interviews, I do a bunch of research and I write some notes and I think of some questions, and then we just see where the conversation goes. And it's always about trying to have an open, free conversation. So there's a couple of bits that came up in research we didn't end up talking about, but I thought I'd just mention them now because it might be interesting for context. First one is I reached out to Ron Rice to ask him just if he had memories of the sessions or the time around then, and he mentioned some stuff that we'll come to in the episode. But he also said, really interestingly, and I didn't realise this, that the original vinyl release of Manzanita ran at the correct tempo, speed, whatever, so it's kind of a 440 hertz kind of pitch. But then the CD release was slightly out, and the subsequent release on Real Gone Vinyl of the re-release of Manzanita is also slightly out. So the actual only version of Manzanita that runs the correct concert pitch is the original vinyl, and I hadn't realised that. I only have the CD of it, so I'm going to see if I can find the original vinyl and have a listen to that. Second thing is, Tony mentions in the Still Inside book that Tim Stafford and Caroline Wright put together that the sessions for Manzanita were where David Grisman originally coined the phrase spacecraft. They were talking about what to call this music, and he suggested that. So that's the kind of origin of that. But the other thing that I hadn't realised, I found digging back through the book, and maybe I'd read this and forgotten, but Tony had started recording this album once before. This is what it says in the book. It said, I'd actually started the album, 8 or 9 tunes at least, in September of 77 or so, with Grisman, Bill Amatnik, Darryl Anger as the primary band. We did Little Sadie, Blue Railroad Train, and the classic tunes, but it just wasn't there. I was so displeased with what was coming down that I canned it and threw it away. I didn't realise that. So it's just, interesting to hear this album that is an absolute classic started out differently. So I thought I'd just mention those because they don't come up in the course of the interview, and I felt like I would have had to shoehorn them in as we were talking, but thought you might be interested to hear them. That's it, all the usual stuff, bluegrassjamalong.com for lists of the interviews, links to socials, all that kind of thing. As I say, keep your ears peeled. I will be putting another episode out that's just running through the kind of results of the favourite Tony albums poll that I did. I'm sure some of you took part in that and have seen some of the social posts. But yeah, I'll put that out later. But for now, here is my interview with Alex Graf about Tony Rice's Manzanita. Enjoy. Alex, welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's an honor.
I am always really excited for these episodes where we chat about somebody's favourite record, because you have a totally different kind of conversation than when somebody's talking about music they've made or what they're up to or like what's going on in their life. And I'm excited about this one because you've chosen Manzanita. And
absolutely,
how this sort of kicked off was I'm on your email list and I got an email from you basically saying this album changed your life. So I'd love to hear about that before we get any further in.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my trajectory into bluegrass is abnormal. Some people would describe it as late onset bluegrass, rather than early onset. And so I came from this jazz background growing up in New York State, upstate New York. And, it took me a long circuitous path to get to the world of bluegrass and Tony Rice. And I remember the first time I heard Manzanita, earlier in my bluegrass journey, but deep into my musical journey. And I don't think I fully understood it at that point because I just didn't have the context. And on Manzanita, the context of what's going on there is so crucial to like really, anybody can appreciate it, I think. But you gain this deeper level once you understand the context of bluegrass as a music and then Tony's journey as a musician and all the other musicians that played on it, kind of where they're at. I'm no expert in all the history, but, I remember it probably didn't hit me until I was a couple years into like really diving into flat picking. And then it made more sense about, how incredible of a recording it is. And we can talk more about that. But, I think since that point, it's just one of those records that, as I mentioned on that email I sent out that you got, is like, no matter how many times I listen to it personally, there's always something new, that I can get out of it. And it's like anything, like no matter where I am, like whatever I'm searching for in that moment in my musical journey, if I listen for it in that record, it's like I can find some type of message or some type of bit of information that is helpful. It's this pillar. So I'm gushing,
Yeah, well, it's funny, isn't it? I remember the email also said that you hadn't listened to it for a while and somebody had reminded you and you and I have that relationship with a lot of them. I have that relationship with the Beatles music. I have it with a record like Nick Drake's Pink Moon that I just adore. Absolutely. And I hadn't listened to it for probably like 3 or 4 years because I've just listened to it so much in my life. And I just had the feeling, I need to put that on. And I put it on. It's like, why don't I listen to this more? This is brilliant. And I love those kinds of records. Exactly what you say. You go back, and even though you feel like you know every note of them, there's always something in there. And like you just said, it's a fascinating point in Tony's career. This record comes out, and the kind of the speed at which iconic music is coming out at this point is just nuts. You've got the end of 77, the first Grisman Quintet record. Then 78, they record Hot Dog and Manzanita. Then early 79, acoustics, Hot Dog comes out, Manzanita comes out, acoustic comes out, Roses in the Snow with Emmylou Harris. Then you've got Scared for Ice. Then you've got like Tony's last gig with Grisman, and this is all in the space of 2 years.
Yeah, he went on a tear, right? That's what people say. I mean, even beyond that, right? Like, look, sometimes we get so myopic about bluegrass. Like, let's not forget, like 1979, what was going on with music, right? Like, I just did a little Google search. Like, what's the top hits? Donna Summer, Blondie, My Sharona. Like, in that reference point, it's like, whoa, that is nuts. But yeah, I mean, Tony obviously went on a tear at that point in his life, and it just seems like what a great record to kind of introduce the world into what he was really all about. I mean, maybe no other record could state it in such a fusion kind of way.
Yeah, it's got this lovely confluence of stuff because he's done the Grisman Quintet, he's done like the J.D. Crowe 0044 record, which was iconic, and this record, because J.D. Crowe was supposed to play on this record and he didn't, and so you've got, if he'd been on it, it had been quite a New South kind of sound, but you've got Grisman on it on a few tracks, and there's a very kind of Grisman sound to some of it, and then you've got the title track, which is like Tony distilling everything he's learned from those couple of years with the Grisman Quintet. And so you've got this kind of rock solid, incredible bluegrass core to it. You've got this kind of dog music thing going on, and also Tony just being Tony. So you've got this beautiful mix of all the things he's learned so far coming out on this record.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've always heard about a rumor or a story I heard about, supposedly, I don't know if this is true, and maybe somebody else can confirm this or deny this, that Crowe got sick before the session. I don't know if that's true or not, but there maybe originally was supposed to be banjo on it. And I just like, Tony obviously had the ability to, especially with those players and with Crowe himself, to just blend so well. And to play what was right for the ensemble. But it does make me wonder, like, if there was banjo on that record, how different would it have been? And not that it would have been better or worse, but it maybe thinking of it the opposite way of, like, the space that suddenly occurred because there's no banjo on the record, not to knock banjo players, just allowed this different type of playing that Tony instantly recognized. All right, here's the space. And that's one of the most incredible parts about the record, is that rhythmic space that opens up and he fills it, and it turns into this like unbelievable conversational thing. And that could have been there with banjo too, don't get me wrong, but it's just really curious how that all worked out and kind of the legend of it.
Well, Tony says in the Still Inside book that Tim Stephen and Caroline Wright put out, like, in his words, he says Crowe got sick and was supposed to be there. But he also says, like, well, I was used to playing without a banjo player in the Grisman Quintet, so I didn't mind.
Totally.
And it does leave, because not only is banjo, like, there's two elements to banjo for me. One is that because of the constant roll, it fills that space. But it is also a really strong spice. Like, the sound of a banjo compared to all those other instruments is a really strong, unique flavor. And when you take it out, everything else has a little bit of room to breathe. And like you say, not in a better way or a worse way, but suddenly you've got this sonic palette. And it's what I love about the Grisman Quintet, is you can hear stuff a little bit more because there's no banjo. And you've got that here. And it's just, so many banjo players say they learned by playing along to this record because there was nobody doing the banjo parts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what a gift to banjo players. Now you have a full record just to practice to.
It's like, I can't remember who said it. It might have been Chris Eldridge was talking about, there's one of the Ray Charles records that has no guitar on, which is just, perfect to play along to. It's the trio, and there's just space for you to be you in there. And I love the idea of that. And also, so it sounds like everybody was sick on this record. So J.D. Crowe didn't make it because he was sick. I've heard two different bits about this, but Ricky Skaggs wasn't there for the first sessions. They cut the first stuff without him. I think Tony said he was sick. I think Jerry said that he was working on an Emmylou Harris, Linda Ronstadt record that never came out. So they started the sessions without him and overdubbed him back onto some stuff. They'd already cut, I think, 4 tunes before he arrived. And then at one point, Tony gets sick, and so the next sessions have like... So there's this, because I think Tony's idea was to try and overdub as little as possible on this record.
Yeah, for sure.
And they had to a bit, because Ricky plays mandolin and fiddle on some of it, obviously. And he's great. Like, there's some amazing fiddle breaks on this record.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's just, I love that that kind of confluence of circumstance, that you have this classic thing that we all love because it is what it is. And yeah, it sort of feels like it came about that way just because that's the way it came about. And so was this the first Tony Rice record you'd heard?
Absolutely. Yep. No doubt
and as
about
you're
it.
Coming at it from like a jazz, because from a string band perspective, what a lot of people love about Tony is bringing that jazz sensibility into it. If you're coming at it from the other angle, like how are you hearing that as a record?
Well, that's why I said it didn't really fully make sense, right? Without more context. That's why I probably, like, the first time I listened to it, I remember being intrigued with it, but it didn't hit me like it did later, because of just lack of information and context. That's a good question. I remember just hearing the richness of Tony's voice on the recording and really being kind of jarred. Like, I had never really heard, like, obviously we all love his guitar playing and his rhythm guitar and his lead, but I mean, his singing is just incredible. And I remember being kind of also confused. Everything about it, I kind of get the sense that a lot of things coming into that world, hearing Tony for the first time in that regard, in that record, it was kind of confusing to me because it was so jarring, and like the tonality of his voice even is so raw, but like there's this clarity and this richness to it. And I remember just never really having heard something like that before, like I grew up listening to Kurt Cobain and that has a rawness to it, but in a different way. And I don't know, it's just, I definitely remember hearing Tony's voice and there was something to it I couldn't quite understand. And I think that actually drew me in.
Well, and it's something that gets forgotten sometimes by some people, I think, because of the guitar. Like, it is quite, it's, in some ways it's really rich and really warm, but he's also pretty unadorned. He's not ornamenting lots. He's just delivering you a story.
And I think that's kind of what I had never really heard before, especially in, jazz world and all this vibrato and everything and affect. Like, having an affect to your voice is kind of a normal thing, like in all types of music. And I feel like he didn't really have this affect or like this intense vibrato. And it was just a style I wasn't used to. And yeah, it's just it's raw. And it's like you said, he's really telling you how it is.
I think that's why with some of the kind of more singer-songwriter side of things, like songs like when he's on this record, Gin Sullivan and Home from the Forest, and like the lyrics really grab you because there's nothing, he's not trying to sell it to you. He's just presenting it to you in a way that you want it. It's like, but there's no kind of, listen how well I'm singing this. It's just him communicating him.
Yeah, there's an honesty to it for sure.
Yeah, that's a great word for it. And that whole question of voice is really interesting, isn't it? Because like having a voice is sort of your job as a musician, is to communicate you rather than what you think you should sound like or whatever. And he definitely does that vocally. But I think that one of the lovely examples of that on this record is like Tony definitely plays Novation on this record, probably just on the title track. But most people, if you line up all his records and go which track's Novation and which not, you can't really tell because he sounds so much like Tony that even on two wildly different guitars, what you're really hearing more than anything is still Tony, which is quite an achievement. I
mean, that just adds to the legend of that record, and the intrigue and the mystery of it. And the kind of, I think overall to me, what this record represents is just a questioning my assumptions. And I think that Ovation story also questions everybody's assumptions about, the legend of his tone, of the richness of his guitar. And then you find out, on a couple tracks, he's definitely playing the Ovation and people are like, what? And that just questions everything you think about Tony Rice. and ultimately, like you said, he speaks through the guitar, regardless of whether it's the Antique or the Ovation or, maybe something else we don't even know that he played on it.
Well, certainly by the record after this, by Acoustics came after this. And if you read the liner notes for that, it sort of says, thanks to Martin Guitars, Ovation and Santa Cruz. So they're clearly all on that record.
Yeah.
but I don't know that I would know which was which just by sticking my headphones on and listening to it. We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collings Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collings Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collingsguitars.com.
Yeah, every time I think I know, like, I probably don't. Like, I think supposedly, right, the ovation is used on Manzanita. I think we can confirm that from what I hear. But, you know, sometimes I hear Blackberry Blossom and I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's hard to tell, but really that doesn't even matter. And that's one of the coolest parts about the record, again, is just like, you know, questioning assumptions about what bluegrass is, about what's possible, about this fusion component of what Tony did, which pays homage truly to what Bill Monroe did, and you know, the origins of the genre is like this kind of fusion and blending, and that's one of the things I really love about it.
That thing of like, I've been talking to people about Tony Rice records on social media for the last few days, just kind of, I've been fascinated to hear what people like and why. One of the reasons Michael Daves said that he loves this record is that it's got some of the best kind of kickoffs of any bluegrass record. Full stop, you know, like this.
Yep.
And you go in with the first track with Old Train and, you know, you're straight into a world. It's that, and that I guess this came from Tony listening to jazz, but this idea of not just starting everything on the obvious beat, or being willing to take a lick you already play and start it a beat later just to confuse people, or, you know.
Yeah, that's one of the confounding parts of Tony's playing always. I mean, obviously it's the Clarence White reinterpreted syncopation and the right hand kind of cross-picking sweeps that he does and leaves you unsure of where things are, and then you kind of land home when the bass kicks in, pretty much. But gosh, I mean, iconic kicks, just like the greatest guitar kicks for sure. And just it's so unbelievable, really, when you learn to play some of these kicks and you've heard it for so long and it seems straightforward and it's just a reinterpretation of the melody ultimately. And then you dig into it and you realize, oh my gosh, the syncopation is just going to kick your butt, because he makes it sound so natural, and it really is so natural to his playing. That's the thing. And he can improvise that stuff. But for somebody who's not used to that, God, it's super jarring.
I remember just like hearing the kickoff for Blue Railroad Train and thing, because it's so smooth and you think, oh, I could do that, until you have a go and you go, no, I can't do that.
Yep.
Like I can play the notes, but...
And even some of the fingerings too, like to be able to get some of those pull-offs are not what you think they would be. I've had to, you know, I learn it by ear from the record, and then I watch somebody else do it. I'm like, what? Like that's up there at the third fret and not using like that's crazy, you know, or like not using an open string. And that's all like a manipulation of syncopation, really, to me. And some of it surely is tone, but a lot of that stuff is about how to get the pull off in the right spot. And I mean, the way his hands and his pinky in particular worked is very different than most guitar players.
Well, and you were saying about the right hand before with the sweeps and various things that he does, and it's all about how he wants to emphasize things. Like everybody else is just doing alternate picking, and he's going, well, where do I want this beat to land, and where do I want this phrase to be? And doing all this stuff that, because he does it so well, sounds really simple.
Yeah, I mean, it was simple to him. It was natural to him, right? And he like developed that wild right hand technique with all the downs. And I love to talk about that stuff. You know, for a lot of students and folks ask me about like, oh, you know, should I learn this exactly like Tony? Or like a lot of, you know, Church Street Blues, right? Like, should I learn this exactly like Tony? And that's a whole nother topic for another day. But, you know, a lot of the times it's like, well, alternate picking is kind of the thing. Like, you can learn the Tony version, but really like alternate picking is what's going to help the most people, the most amount of times, right? And that's true. But then if you really like listen in with headphones and you're kind of hip to like how he's using the down, down, downs and where he's putting the ups, it actually like physically makes so much sense and makes some of the syncopated stuff make so much more sense when you feel it. Like when you hear that and then when you try to emulate it with your right hand, it kind of, it's just so nuts. What he figured out is incredible.
It's a bit like my son is 13 and he's learning to play the drums and he's obsessed by the Beatles and he's watching Ringo, and Ringo has this weird sort of swishy sideways way of playing the hi-hat that nobody else has. And so my son's going, well, I'm going to try like that because Ringo does that. And I'm like, go for it. But like, I wouldn't base your technique on that if I was you, because A, nobody else does that, and B, this guy was originally left-handed anyway. So.
Yeah.
But it's just people do what works, you know.
Yeah, there's something to be gained from really adhering to that Tony style, for sure. But I wouldn't recommend it for everybody.
It requires a very certain kind of thumb control that most of us don't have.
For sure, and just like angling of the right hand too. I know that's something for me that, you know, I angle my right hand in a certain way, and to be able to achieve, I don't, you know, typically do Tony's kind of sweeping stuff, although I like to emulate his cross picking, but I really notice for me, like I have to tilt my hand in like my wrist in a totally different direction than what feels natural to achieve that, you know. It's funny.
And so by the time you kind of started listening to this record and getting it, so presumably the kind of the more traditional stuff on this record, like Blackberry Blossom and 9 Pound Hammer and whatever, stuff that you'd then come across and sort of playing yourself. And that is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because like you said at the top, context with stuff like this. Like if you just hear Tony play Blackberry Blossom, it's great. It's brilliant. But once you've like heard other people play it, and it's like hearing him play Gold Rush on Church Street Blues. It's not that different, and yeah, it's completely different. But if you haven't played it yourself and heard other people play it week in, week out at a jam and then heard that, it's a different beast, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, everybody at the jam learned it from the Tony record, right?
Yeah, there's that too.
so then it makes even more sense. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, the context is really fun for this record.
It is a really good point, actually. There are so many tunes that, like, people now hear them the way Tony played them, or the way Doc played them. Like, you know, Black Mountain Rag is Doc's tune, in the same way that Big Sciota is now Ross Barenberg's. It's just, you know, you do get that, and Tony's probably got more of those than most people.
Yeah, per capita, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, you know, I just also want to say, like, of course, this is Tony Rice record, and it's his thing, but really, like, the ensemble, part of the reason it's so good is because, yeah, it's about Tony, but like really it's so conversational that it's so much more than him. And I know that probably doesn't get like overlooked necessarily, but I just like, we're talking about Tony. It's this group effort though. And he obviously was able to create that and like bring that energy but it's just like one of the most conversational bluegrass records you could ever listen to, I think.
Yeah, and I love that word for sort of string band music because it is. And you've had Tony going through a couple of years of the Grissman Quintet where like for a year they didn't really go out and gig. They just sat around and played with each other. And they're working out how to do these bigger, and he's come out of these things. Some of them are really long, like heads and improvisation and they're going to go where they're going to go, and they just keep building these huge builds. And the tracks are all much shorter and much tighter. And not everybody gets a break on every track, but still that ability to have the conversation going in such a tight space, it's extraordinary.
I mean, take Manzanita, right? Nobody's really truly improvising, right? They're interpreting the melody here and there, but it's really just, everyone gets a turn, and then there's that kind of conversational back and forth at the end. But yet it's never boring, right? It's not like, oh, I'm just playing the melody. Okay, now it's your turn. Now you just play the melody, right? It's like every piece of it is like woven, like stitched with like, okay, this kind of rhythmic idea here that gets passed around and then bumped back and forth. And that's, it just, I think that like that context, talking about context, probably on my first listen, I was like, oh, that's a cool melody. What else, right? And just like I think that's just, it just points to how important like deep critical listening really is, and how you can do that especially with a bluegrass band. Just like listen to one instrument, or just like focus, like close your eyes, listen with headphones, and just listen, like try to identify every moment of like rhythmic conversation. Doesn't even need to be like note choice, but just like, where is it? And if you close your eyes, you'll be like, oh my gosh, everybody is, adding a little piece here and there, like not all at the same time. They're very aware. Everyone's very aware of space, of rhythmic space. But it's just so like, that's one of my favorite things to do with this record. It's just like close my eyes and listen for that rhythm, kind of like ball being passed back and forth and around. And it's like the coolest thing is like, it's not always the soloist who's up front that has the rhythmic idea. So many times it's somebody waiting. A lot of times it's Tony, playing rhythm guitar and passing something around, but he's sometimes grabbing it from somebody else. And it's, that's just like, and again, Manzanita, that track, they're just playing the melody and kind of reinterpreting it, It's not like going that far out harmonically. It's kind of just restating. And it's such a great melody, obviously. So,
same with Blue Railroad Train. The kickoff is basically a take on the melody, and then Tony's break is just a slight take on that. It's not like he's off somewhere different. But it's really true, and maybe it comes back to that banjo thing as well. There's bits of fiddle backup you hear because the banjo's not there. And when Tony's taking a break, you just get these little bits of fiddle backup that you wouldn't probably hear otherwise. And maybe the fiddle wouldn't need to do them otherwise because the banjo's kind of rolling through or whatever. And it's wonderful. And you've got Jerry Douglas, who is probably like one of the masters of conversational instrument playing, in just whether he's playing with a singer or just there's a little gap in a phrase and he'll put two notes in or one note or a little phrase, that just his sense for that is extraordinary.
I think the moment that really has always done it the most for me, honestly, on the record is Blackberry Blossom, when Jerry is taking his break and Tony is just, for anybody else, it would be Tony is stepping on all over the soloist's toes, right? He's just like syncopating here and there and these little pops and these flutters, and Jerry just like rolls with it and like chews it, spits it right back. And it's the coolest thing. And it's like, man, I want every time I'm playing, my goal is to always be like that. And it's hard. It's so hard to, to develop that trust, the level of trust you need to have with somebody. Some people maybe just instantly have it, but for most of us, like, you need to develop that trust with another instrumentalist to be able to do that, on both ends, like venturing into stepping on toes, crowding the rhythm. It's so incredible. And just to get to have a recording of that is really special.
There's a couple of quotes from that. I emailed Jerry before we had this conversation to ask him if he had any memories of recording that record. And one of the things he said was that the camaraderie was mighty and it transferred to the music. And then, like, sort of the flip side of that, Tony, what did Tony describe it as in the book? He said something about it just basically being one big stoned party, essentially.
Well, I think also, like, so much of Tony's music and the way his affect is seen as, at least outwardly facing to the public, as, obviously incredibly smart, witty, but very polished, and very serious about the craft and the art. And while that is true, you can't help but listen to this record, or I can't, and just think that they're all kind of giving each other these elbow jokes and kind of messing with each other. And it's all kind of like this tongue-in-cheek rhythmic joke that they're playing out in real time. There's a lot of humor to it, even though it's obviously the craft is very serious, and that's kind of his public persona, it seems like, from my vantage point. And that's the best type of music, right? That doesn't actually take itself too seriously to the point where the art it's stuck up.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this in the podcast before, but I've got a really good friend who said his favourite people in the world are people who have something they do that they take very seriously indeed, but they don't take themselves at all seriously. And it's that thing of like having a really serious thing and holding it quite lightly at the same time, which is always a joke, because it feels like you're in on the joke because of that.
Yeah,
it feels like you're part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's that trust thing you were saying as well. There's a track on one of the early Baylor records. I think it's Natural Bridge. I think it's called Daybreak, and it's just a duet between Baylor and Jerry. It's one banjo, one dobro. It's very exposed, very quiet, very sparse, and it's one of the most beautiful things because you're just hearing two people, like you say, like who trust each other, having a chat, essentially, and passing bits backwards and forwards, playing together. And that's the thing about music, is you can have a conversation where you're speaking at the same time. And in a conversational way, that doesn't work, but in music, it really can. And just hearing, there's loads of that all over this record, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole thing.
The other thing Jerry said when I asked him, he said he remembered, he said basically there was, once they'd done a bit of overdubbing of Ricky because he wasn't there for the beginning of it. He said one of his strongest memories was recording the solo from Home from the Forest. And they stuck him down in the stairwell to get like maximum natural reverb on it.
Yeah, I've heard legend of multiple stairwell recordings. I've heard legend of that. I mean, maybe that's something also that supposedly Grisman did a bunch of. I love it, recording in familiar places, unfamiliar to a studio setting is, maybe that could give you that whimsical nature that you need to be able to let go of yourself and really just perform.
And it's totally different from like putting an effect on afterwards, isn't it? Because you are playing with the effect as it plays out in real time rather than like slapping a reverb on it afterwards. If you're playing with it.
And that just gets straight to the core of the ethos of a lot of bluegrass and like this search for authenticity and rawness in tone of wood in a space in a wooden box, pretty much. So
I think that's one of the things I love most about string band music, or just acoustic music in general, whether could be a string quartet, could be anything, but it's just that there is sort of nowhere to hide. If you want volume, you've got to generate it. If you want tone, you've got to generate it. If you want some sort of weird effect, you've still got to generate it. And there's something about it's very direct communication, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why, like, the bigger context of 1979 and this record is like, holy cow, just so dedicated to that craft. Everybody on that record, and obviously Tony, and that's special.
And Tony was saying, just digging back through this Still Inside book, and he was saying that he really wanted Grisman on there because he wanted that kind of like Grisman sound on some of the tracks. But Grisman wasn't supposed to be playing music at this point because he had injured himself, basically. He got tendonitis and wasn't supposed to be playing much mandolin. But Tony was like, look, do you think you can? He's like, yeah. Like try keeping him off it. But I've spoken to David as well about that, because that period where they recorded, Grisman basically told me that doing Dog's Bull on Hot Dog, which has got that twin mandolin part that's really kind of harmonized, fast stuff. He played both the tracks. He said basically that's what gave me tendonitis.
Go figure.
That's why. And this was recorded around the same sort of time. I think it was recorded just afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, well, everybody was fighting through some ailment, it sounds like, on this record.
I know, and the more you hear about it, and this is why I love it, it may all be part of the mythology, because there's some bits about this record that I've heard different versions of, like different versions of the myth that can't both be true. And some of the stuff that, whether it's true or not, you sort of hope it is. Like I messaged Ron Rice as well, and I said, look, I know you weren't probably there to recording, but do you remember much of that time? Because I've chatted to him a little bit in the past, and he sent me a tape of rehearsals that partly seemed to be Grisman stuff, but also included Manzanita before it was recorded. So I was saying, you must have been around at this point. What do you remember? And he said, the biggest thing I remember was going to the studio at Arch Street, and it's the first time he'd met Bill Wolfe. And he said they'd recorded the stuff, but they were mixing it down to take back. And he said that they went back to Tony's apartment and played it for the guys from Rounder Records. They sat on the sofa and listened to these mixes, and then they finished, and they sort of turned to Tony going like, sort of, where's side B? And Tony was like, no, that's it, I've run out of money, that's all we've got. And they all kind of sit and have a quick conflab, and they're like, oh, what do we do? And they go, right, you can have some more money to go and record side B then.
No way.
And I asked Bill Nowlan about that, and he doesn't recall that. But I sort of don't mind either way. It's a great story.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, for me, I mean, all those legends and the stories are great, and it can inflate the sense of the music for some. But like, honestly, you know, I'm the type of person that I forget a lot of those details always. Like, whenever I'm reading a novel, I can't hold in my head all the names of the people or all the towns, you know? I have a hard time remembering all that stuff. And it's like, it's fun and it adds to the lore, but for me, I don't know. I just, like, the record is so beyond legend in just what it sounds like that it's like, how could it get any more? What type of lore could add to my experience at this point, you know?
Yeah. Totally. Well, it's the same with the Beatles, isn't it? It's that all this mythology builds up and all this kind of story, but actually you just simply put the records on and that's all that matters.
Yeah, you don't need the lore for it to be like legendary.
No, but it's fun, and there's internet forums full of this stuff that people are happy to debate for hours. But yeah, it is totally, it's the kind of music thing. And I really, it's one of the reasons I enjoyed digging back through and just reading some of the things Tony said about it, because he said he was particularly fond of Ricky Skaggs' fiddle solo on Old Train. He said that was just, you know, and he said that track, nobody could really work out to kick it off. And somebody went, well, you do it, Tony. He went, oh, all right. But that kickoff is just, you know, if you're going to sit somebody down and play people the best ways to start a song, it's going to be on your list.
Yeah. I mean, it just really goes to show how important just iterations of melody are in bluegrass, you know, and just like what it truly means, especially in the bluegrass context, to have a hold or a grasp on a melody or a melodic idea, you know, because it's just versions and iterations and you know, you can do so much improvising just by finding out all the ways you can play one melody like that. That's kind of the secret to a lot of it, that can get lost. And it's like, yeah, it just goes to show like how firm a grasp Tony had over like that melody, really, and being able to interpret it on the fly, and how deep a lot of these melodies were like in him, you know?
Well, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are people who look at the way flat picking has evolved kind of since Tony. Mm-hmm. And there is definitely a thread now where some people will just improvise over the changes and not quote the melody at any point at all.
Sure.
And that's sometimes considered one of the effects of Tony Rice on music. And they're two totally separate things, because Tony's ability to, like we've just talked around, nudge a melody around and also use vocabulary that, you know, that it's all in there together. And one element of it can get separated sometimes to the point where people don't play the tune at all.
It's super interesting because, I mean, just it's a wormhole of a topic of sticking to the melody, interpreting the melody, and what Tony did and how he either did stick to the melody or chose to depart many times from the melody, or what you consider the melody to be, or what the song to even be, right? And it's just so interesting how his whole life, that his personal history, relationship with that, and then how we all as guitar players who want to model after him and play like Tony, play his melodies and play things exactly the way he did and interpret it from his interpretation. And it's like both of these things are true, where like he strayed from the melody, but then you're playing the exact Tony Rice break or quoting like an exact Tony break or a line, and it's like, well, I'm sticking to Tony's melody. And it's just kind of interesting how that works in bluegrass. And I've heard people say, Tony was the most melodic player, and then I hear people who say Tony didn't stick to the melody much, and it's always it's a super interesting conversation.
Well, and it depends what your definition of melodic is as well, doesn't it? Because I wish I knew where this was from, but there was something that Tony had said about himself that I kind of unearthed when we were doing the Church Street Blues stuff a couple of years ago, and he'd sort of said, I'm not really capable of playing melodically like some of the other guys can. And I think he may have maybe cited Russ Barenberg or somebody, said, I'm not really that melodic a player. And it's like, well, define melodic for starters, because...
I mean, improvising, some would say, is creating a new melody, right? So, I mean, we're not always speaking in the same definitions of what that means. And it means very different things to folks, especially in bluegrass. But I appreciate all interpretations.
Well, and it's really interesting because then you fast forward like a couple of decades and you've got another version of the track Manzanita on the Unit of Measure album, which was also... Tony said that he didn't play this track live very often, didn't play Manzanita live that much. And there's a recording with basically the band that are on Manzanita from the Great American Music Hall, sort of slightly later than that. But then it crops up again on Unit of Measure, and it's, it's clearly the same track, but it's also reimagined, kind of on the spot, I think. It doesn't sound massively scripted. And there it is 20 years later, kind of the same, and again, like a new thing.
Yeah, I mean, Tony was a great reinterpreter, really, when it comes down to it. If you think of his whole career of, choosing songs, basically, from different people's song books and reinterpreting them. That's kind of what, in a way, it's what he really did maybe the best. And that even applies to his own melodies too, you can see across time.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, actually, because one of the things I sort of noted down just listening through the record for this is exactly that. It's a curation of stuff. And obviously Manzanita is Tony's tune. And after this record, he goes on to do some things like Acoustics and Mar West and Still Inside and whatever that. They do have quite a bit of his composed stuff on it. And he goes through a chunk of maybe like having more of his own tunes on any records than he's had before, or probably will do again. But then he goes on to, you've got Church Street Blues, which is again just a beautiful curation of stuff. And you're right, there are some figures that are like Tony's one, Del McCoury's one, Doc was one, Alison Krauss is one of these people who don't really write most of their material, but they know how to find the stuff that's going to work for them and entirely make it their own.
Yeah, it's like, I'll go out on a limb now and say, like, sometimes I feel like those powerful reinterpreters in music, like, they must just recognize, you know what? There really are only like 4 or 5 tunes in Western music, right? So, like, I'll experiment in writing some, but really, it's the art is in the context and the interpretation. That's me going out on a limb and having a hypothesis about that. But I mean, that's kind of the beauty of bluegrass in a way, and why I was drawn to it in the first place, coming from jazz, is like this active of reinterpreting the canon or reinterpreting a tune from outside the genre and giving it life within a new context. Is like, that is one of the most fun things you can do in in music, you get to transform a certain thing into something completely new. And whether we're talking about melody or Tony reinterpreting other people's tunes or anybody else in bluegrass who does a lot of that, I think that the genre is really great for that as a model of like what we're supposed to do.
Well, and jazz and bluegrass get compared for those reasons, don't they? In that
Sure.
you can, if you turn up to a jam with a bunch of jazz musicians, you're probably going to know a bunch of material you can just start playing. True with bluegrass as well. They're improvisational, but often based on a kind of a head or a agreed melody. I'm interested in how that felt coming out, because I've spoken to a lot of bluegrass players who are primarily string band players, then started playing around with some swing and some jazz, like a lot of people have. Tony being one of those, and but a lot of the players have done a bit of that. But I remember talking to Ethan Sherman on the podcast, who did the same sort of journey you've done of starting off outside and coming in a bit. And what sort of struck you about the way bluegrass approaches that compared to jazz, or did it not feel that different?
Oh, it didn't feel different at all. Sure, the specifics of the language and the dialect are different than something like bebop, but I mean, really specifically bebop, which was kind of the world I was attempting to be in, although I guess there isn't necessarily like a bebop scene that's super active, but I think that's kind of like the archetype of how a lot of jazz musicians improvise and think of themselves as improvisers. But I mean, bebop is there's so many similarities to bluegrass in terms of timing. I don't mean metric timing, but historical timing and the fusion component, the canon, the shared language, or within each genre, the language, the way it reinterprets popular music, or unpopular music now for that matter, maybe. It felt so similar. The thing about bluegrass, the jam circles, is that they were a little bit kinder, a little bit more forgiving, which definitely was a plus. But it felt, long story short, it felt super familiar. The format is very, very much, they're related, they're cousins.
It's interesting actually, because they do both have an element of having a recognized vocabulary in a way that some musics don't. And there are key, you listen to jazz players who've sort of learned the blues and then gone from there, and there's certain things you are always going to hear. Even somebody like Brad Mehldau, you hear him play a piece that is entirely in a major key, and there are certain like blues licks that you're going to hear even from somebody who can constantly create in the moment endlessly.
Yeah,
Still
and like
short,
really the phrasing in both the genres, it's like the phrasing is almost a language. Less, the further you get away from maybe the origin, so-called, of like, Charlie Parker or like Clarence White, Tony Rice, whoever you kind of think is maybe that corollary, maybe the less we are direct quoting every single line, unless you're a strict scripturalist of those two worlds. But the phrasing, the timing, the expectations there, that to me is really the language. And like, it's clear from people who want to get into bebop, the thing that is clearly the marker of how long have they been playing bebop is the phrasing. And the same thing exists for bluegrass. Someone who wants to get into bluegrass flat picking, it's the phrasing. It's like, that is the true crux of like what I think we mean by language, really, when it comes down to it. But yeah, it's so cool to think about supposedly two very different genres and realize just how similar they are. And to get back to Manzanita, for me personally, that was a record that, again, kind of confounded me and messed with my expectations and drove me to understand it. And I remember, like, shortly after truly getting into Manzanita and getting into flat picking, like learning more about Tony. And then I had this realization. There's many quotes about Tony and jazz and him loving Oscar Peterson, and hearing Dave Brubeck for the first time. But I remember there was a specific quote. from somewhere that mentioned that Tony also was fond of Bill Evans, the pianist. There are a couple different Bill Evanses out there. Both and all are great, actually. But the pianist, the jazz pianist, and I was so just, and still love Bill Evans and his chord voicings and when I heard that, I was like, oh my God, that just broke it. That just broke every wall between these two genres, just smashed it. And that was like, I felt like I had unlocked some secret knowledge, of like, oh, I know this from this world. And now I realize that they're connected. And I don't know if other people know this. Maybe they do. And I'm just late to the party, but like that was so seductive in a way. Anyway, we got back to Tony from talking more shop about bebop and whatnot. But,
well, then you listen to where Tony went after this and some of those, and voicings is a really interesting part of how he develops from that. Because once you understand that he was a big fan of jazz piano players, you can hear it. Like he's choosing his chord voicings very carefully and he would go back to the same ones over and over again. He's not just playing your standard jazz guitar chords over the changes. He's finding the voicings that he wants.
Yep. That meet in the middle, really,
It's not, it's that thing that people do once they realize the bass player can hold down the bottom bit. You choose the notes within the chord you want, but also then you hear that Tony was a big fan of jazz drummers, and then you listen to his rhythm playing. And I've had this conversation before, I think it was with Chris Eldridge on the podcast when we talked about, I think it was Baylor's Drive record we were talking about. But it's that thing of, like, rock drummers are doing the kind of four square, bass, snare, bass, snare, bass, snare. Jazz drummers float and punctuate. And Tony's got that in spades, of just sort of playing really quietly, but then he'll just pop out with a comment and as soon as somebody's told you those two things, you can't not hear them.
Yeah. I don't know who it was. I should figure out who it was and give them credit where credit's due, but who compared Tony's right hand to the drumming of Elvin Jones, who played with Coltrane. And when I heard that too, I was like, oh my gosh, what a great comparison. And, there's a section of Love Supreme on the second track of that record where McCoy Tyner's taking just this like ridiculous solo, and there's this extended line where him and Elvin just are just, it's otherworldly. And you hear that, and you hear Elvin Jones, and I do hear that in Tony's playing in his right hand. Like, it's not a 1-to-1 comparison by any means. We're talking about two different art forms with varying histories and greatly different perspectives, but that there's some energy or ethic about both of those two things that kind of coincide, I think. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, and to be able to take, like a approach to a drum kit, which is a four-limbed multi-instrument thing, and translate it into a kind of the way you approach them. Just take it as inspiration and go, how do I emulate that with a pick on 6 strings? It's
well, there's so many. I mean, this is again, we can dive deeper into like how cool it is to do this comparative study of bluegrass in that era and like Coltrane quintet kind of stuff. And like, if you think of Elvin Jones and jazz drummers kind of coming out of that era, timing, right? Timing is the drummer's role traditionally. And then you have somebody like Elvin Jones who turns that on its head, and it's like, well, this is something I'm doing, but really the whole band is creating this sense of timing. And you think about Tony and you're like, well, he freed himself up from having to just do a timing thing. And obviously timing isn't just guitar, but like, I feel like these two things like make a lot of sense to me when I look back and forth at the two. And there's just so many, maybe I'm just projecting it all because I want it to be true, but I think there's so much similar, in just the development of the two musics, alongside each other, and the people who brought new stuff to the world and let guitar players forever think of rhythm as something different, and the person who let jazz drummers think of timing as something different forever. Like that's two things that kind of coincide and develop in different worlds, supposedly.
Well, and there is that constant, bluegrass is one form of music where you sort of accept that everybody is the drummer, like the whole band is the drum kit, and so that also frees everybody up to not be, because everybody else is.
Yep.
And maybe like taking it back to where we started with this, because the banjo isn't there, they all had to, they all had the opportunity to stretch out a bit or sit back a bit, and we have the opportunity to hear them doing it because, of the fact that JD Crowe got sick or whatever, and we're back on the thing of the mythology versus the music. But as we were saying, is there are very few records, like you say, that you can just go back and always hear something. And this is one of them. And it's just, I love that thing, like you were saying, of putting the headphones on and just like listening to a thing. And I do it with Tony's playing, he disappears sometimes. Like his rhythm playing
Entirely.
just sort of vanishes.
Yep.
Going, where is he? Where's he gone?
Yep.
And there he is,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's so many sidebars we could probably talk about for an hour each here, but it's been a really good excuse for me to dig back into this record again and really kind of think about it. And it's just been a joy talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. I'll do it anytime you want to chat.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.